Hi, welcome back to Ask a Creationist. I'm Todd Wood. I'm president of Core Academy of Science. This series we're doing here is intended to answer questions, simple questions that you might have about creation or the Bible or science or whatever. So if you have questions, send us an email and let us know what those are, and we would love to consider that for a future episode. So this week's question, very simple. What is Baraminology? There are lots of ways that we could answer this question. I'm going to do one possible way here. So, if you have another way of thinking about it, that's fine. But I think this is going to be helpful, hopefully. So if we read in Genesis 1, we see that when God creates, for example, plants or fish or birds or creeping things and so forth, he creates them according to their kind, right? So here's Genesis 1:24, and God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds." And this is a command about creation, right? So God is creating things according to their kinds, and it stands apart from the image of God, which is what God creates human beings in. So this is not quite saying just creating all varieties of things. There's clearly something more going on here, almost like a pattern or something. And the Hebrew term here for kind is min, and when we talk about God's creation, one of the words used in Genesis 1 is bara, and so you put those together, bara and min, and you get Baraminology, or Baramin. Baramin being sort of a technical word for the created kind. This is the idea the creationists have had for a very long time. All right, so now when we think about the modern world and its dizzying array of creatures and some things that are not found in the modern world anymore, we see certain patterns that happen over and over again, certain similarities that you can find in different organisms. So for example, if you think about a crocodile and a camel and a zebra, they all have bones, they all have skulls, they all have 4 limbs. If you think about trillium, there are plants that produce flowers. You can think about birds that have feathers. And so there are these similarities that we can see, and we can get more and more and more detailed with this, but I'm not going to belabor that here. When Darwin thought about all these similarities, he decided the reason this happens and the explanation for this is an evolutionary tree. So this is the famous diagram from Origin of Species showing his idea about how things diverge over time, giving us different sorts of creatures in the present, which is sort of at the top of the diagram there. And so this is the famous evolutionary tree. Now, this does not mean that similarity itself is an evolutionary thing, right? People were studying and talking and writing about similarity long before Darwin interpreted it as evolution. And so some examples here. Here's Pierre Bellon's diagram of the human skeleton compared to a bird skeleton, and he's labeling individual elements that correspond. This is from the 16th century. This is one of the earliest diagrams of this sort of comparative anatomy that's published. On the right here we have a quote from Galen writing in the 2nd century AD. This is barely 100 years after the New Testament was being written, talking about the similarity of apes and human beings down to, the individual muscles and arteries and veins and nerves and so forth. So people have thought about and talked about biological similarity, the similarity of organisms, long before Darwin decided that this must be evolutionary. Now, for a baraminologist interested in trying to understand God's creation from the creationist perspective, we kind of wonder, is there a way to focus on similarity without the evolutionary assumptions, without assuming that this means common ancestry? Secondly, could this tell us something then about created kinds? Which I think is a really interesting question. These are both really interesting questions. Very quick example here from the penguins. So when evolutionary biologists study the penguins, they gather up all these sorts of characteristics that are found in penguins and characteristics that are found in birds in general. And they try to organize them into a big, long chart, and then they feed all of that information into a computer program which can generate an evolutionary tree that looks like this. So the branching pattern here is supposed to tell you something about the evolutionary history of the penguins. On the bottom, in the green part of the tree, with all their fancy scientific names, and on the top part of the tree, in the black names, the black lettering there, we have various birds that are not penguins that some people think might be like penguins, things like loons and puffins and albatrosses. Now, what makes this evolutionary is the assumption that this all belongs on one evolutionary tree, right? That this all goes together somehow. In the distant past, there was a common ancestor. And so penguins must be related somehow by evolution to a common ancestor deep in the past, to all the other birds and to all the other creatures on the planet. Now, baraminologists are interested in sort of stripping out the evolutionary part and saying, well, okay, let's just look at the similarity itself. What would happen if we just tried to understand how similar these birds are to penguins? What would happen? What would that look like? Well, I took this information from this evolutionary tree here, ran it through very different set of analysis, and what I got was this. So on the left here, we have little dots that represent the penguins, and on the right are gray dots that represent things that are not penguins. And the distance between the dots is intended to represent how similar they are, right? Or how different they are. So things that are close together are very similar to one another, and things that are far apart are very different from one another. And you can see, as we look at this diagram, that the penguins are pretty diverse. That's one of the first things I noticed. There's a lot of space that they cover in this similarity diagram, but there's a vast, vast gulf between what a penguin is and what the other birds are, the not penguins. And this is something that is really exciting, and is something that you might not necessarily recognize if you're putting everything onto an evolutionary tree, where you assume that these dots are all connected back to some sort of common ancestor. If you don't assume that, well, this is the sort of thing that you get. A well-defined group of penguins that are different, statistically different from other birds. And so that leads to a host of questions. Is this common? Do we see this with other groups? Can we do this with creatures other than the penguins? Does it work on plants? Does it work on fungus? Does it work on microbes? Would it work on people? What can we learn about the created kinds from doing these sorts of analyses? And this is basically what baraminology is all about, right? This is basically what the statistical side of baraminology is all about. We're looking at these groups and clusters of organisms, and we want to know how often do you find these things that are so well defined like the penguins. And even if you have some things that aren't maybe not so well defined as the penguins, maybe they're cats versus dogs where they're actually pretty similar, can you still tell the difference using these techniques of baraminology? So that's sort of the heart of baraminology. It leads to lots of cool questions, and we have lots of research going on to try to answer these questions. So thanks for watching this video. Please check us out at coresci.org. There you will find links to our social media on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, which is a great way to interact with us if you'd like to ask a question for us for future episodes. You can also leave a like on this video. That would help us out a lot. You can make a contribution. We would very much appreciate that at our website. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click on that bell if you would like to be notified when there are new videos available. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.